Odysseus particularly is the great liar of ancient literature.
Yeah.
And he's telling this story about Circe to some people he is receiving hospitality from. And, all of a sudden when you start kind of looking at the scene from that lens, it's like, oh, there was this terrifying witch and I tamed her and she threw herself at me and she was super hot. And like it sort of goes on in this way.
Yes, exactly.
It's very self-serving.
It's the Liars Club Podcast, a weekly conversation filled with insights, tips, and secrets from the myriad of creative people who make stuff up for a living. Stay tuned and you could hear from New York Times bestselling authors, National Book Award finalists, debut novelists, screenwriters, musicians, composers, cartoonists, actors, stand-up comedians, line tamers, and all manner of creators who burn the midnight oil and sometimes their dinner. Whether you're a reader or a fellow writer, join us as we plumb the depths of the creative process for inspiration, semi-plausible stories, and a few laughs. So grab a libation, sit back, and spend some quality time with the creative folks who make stuff up for a living in a lively conversation with the Liars Club.
Good. And then the last question is just how long do you want my answers to be? Do you want me to be fuller in my answers or more?
One word. Maybe two words.
No. We've had people who have answered a question and it has run on for probably 10 minutes.
The entire show.
Yeah.
Well, so just answer the way you want to answer.
Yeah, honestly, Madeline, we want it to be more of an easy, relaxed conversation with you. So whatever you want to answer, however you want to answer is fine with us.
Yeah.
Okay. Wonderful.
Right. So just
don't fuck up.
Whatever it requires, that's right. Thanks, John.
Thanks, John. So just as we reach that moment of comfort, John changed things.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's what he's here for.
That's what
He's undermined our faith in everything. Okay.
There had to be something. Had to be a purpose.
Let's go before this goes on.
So is this half an hour yet?
That's not really over there yet.
Thank
you.
Thank you, Madeline, for showing up. We're gone now.
We want to keep the answers really brief because the questions are so fucking long.
Oh, God.
All right. Then I think we're covered. So that sounds good. You sound good, Madeline. We sound fair.
All right. Okay, that's all we have time for. Thanks so much.
So, ladies and gentlemen, here we are once again with the Liars Club Oddcast. And we have with us Keith Strunk,
John McGoran,
Gregory Frost,
and Mary Jones. And today we are so lucky, guys, because we have such a wonderful writer with us. She is, first of all, an accomplished scholar with a master's and bachelor's in classics from Brown. She's been a teacher in High School of Latin and Greek and Shakespeare. She studied at the University of Chicago, Committee on Social Thought, working toward a PhD, and got another master's at the Yale School of Drama. She's the winner of the Orange Prize for Fiction for her first book, Song of Achilles. It took, I understand, 10 years to write, and it's about the love affair between Achilles and Patroclus. Circe is her newest book, and it's been picked up, I'm so excited to say this, by HBO. It's told from the point of view of Circe, the daughter of Helios, who is god of the sun and the mightiest of the Titans. The gods are threatened by Circe's powers of witchcraft, and so she's banished to a desert island where she hones her occult craft, and crosses paths with famous heroes of mythology, including the Minotaur, Daedalus, Icarus, Medea, and Odysseus. And Circe is a woman who stands alone, unwittingly gathering the wrath of both gods and mortals. And in order to protect what she most loves, she's faced with a choice of belonging to the gods or to mortals. So anyway, we welcome today the author of Circe, Madeline Miller.
And don't worry, we'll edit Mary out.
I'm so happy to be here.
Was that too long? I just wanted to tell the story because I love it so.
It's fine.
Okay.
It's fine, Mary.
Brilliant.
So
thank you for such a lovely introduction.
Thank you for writing such wonderful books.
You're rethinking being here, aren't you?
No, not at all.
We can understand that. Well, you want to go?
Well, yeah, you have a question, so go ahead. I have a ton of questions.
First of all, I love working with and repurposing mythology, fairy tales, folk tales, et cetera, et cetera. So you're working with material that is already chock-a-block with stories. How did you go about repurposing the Odyssey, essentially, or the elements of the Odyssey and the other places where Circe turns up as a minor character into the material for this story?
Yeah, for me, my interest is always sort of the psychology. That's my way into the stories. And so I focus on, usually with both of these novels, there was a character that caught my eye that I sort of wanted to understand more about. And so with Cersei, the episode in the Odyssey with Cersei is narrated, first of all, it's in, the epic style, which is very flattening toward female characters generally, but it's also specifically narrated by Odysseus himself, which to me feels like it is inviting a counter-narrative because, Odysseus particularly is the great liar of ancient literature. Yeah. And he's telling this story about Cersei to some people he is receiving hospitality from. And, all of a sudden when you start kind of looking at the scene from that lens, it's like, oh, there was this terrifying witch and I tamed her and she threw herself at me and she was super hot. And like it sort of goes on in this way.
Yes, exactly.
It's very self-serving. Yeah. So to me, immediately I was sort of thinking like, well, what did she think of this? And also, why would you start turning men into pigs? That's a pretty dramatic thing to do. What would be the reason why someone would do that?
Just not much of a switch.
Right.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's not much of a stretch, really.
I was going to say, a lot of people think they're pigs to begin with.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, go on.
Sorry.
We digress.
Yeah. We ruined it. So you worked from the psychology of Circe as the character rather than Odysseus, who is lying to us, at least in part.
Yes, exactly. And so I always wanted to be framing it around her, and I really wanted to kind of flip the script. And I only, she's just a cameo in the Odyssey, and I very much only wanted Odysseus to be a cameo in her story. I didn't want to be this sort of like epic love story between her and Odysseus because they only know each other for a year, and she's a goddess, so she has a whole eternity that has absolutely nothing to do with him. Right. So I wanted to sort of focus on her life and, how she got to be on the island. I was very interested in the fact that she was born a nymph, which is sort of the lesser, the least of the goddesses. They basically, in mythology, nymphs have absolutely no power whatsoever. They are, the ones who are getting assaulted and raped and given away to husbands that they don't want to marry. They have pretty much no agency over their lives. And yet here is Circe as the first witch in what we call Western literature, seeming to be living a pretty good life on this island, surrounded by lions and wolves. Even the gods are a little wary of her. So how did she go from that, that nymph with no power to the figure we see in the Odyssey? Yeah. So that was also very interesting to me.
So interesting that you mentioned Odysseus talking about, this great witch on this island. She was so hot and everything like that. It's like, wow. So classical literature, modern literature now, it's all sort of the same stuff, basically. Human nature is human nature.
Yes, exactly. And I am a firm believer that, these ancient stories culture has changed and technology has changed, but basically nothing else has changed. And, I think one of the most dramatic examples of that is actually sort of the effects of war and what war does to the human psyche. The ancients didn't have a word for PTSD, but they absolutely understood it. And they very clearly portray it in a number of ancient works, including some tragedies, and I would argue even the end of the Odyssey. And so I think, we're still the same humans that we were, and these are all about human strengths and failings. And so to me, I don't really feel like I have to do anything in order to make it relevant. I feel like it's all just there.
Right.
Definitely. Yeah. Universal themes. Right. Well, I also, Greg asked pretty much one of the questions I was going to ask about how you picked those two characters. Patroclus also was not the main character. Right. And yet you focused in on him. I know you just said that you were countering Odysseus's claims about her, but there were a lot of minor characters. So what was it about Patroclus? What was it about Circe that drew you to those two in particular?
Yeah, well, in the case of Patroclus, it was really this sort of mystery about him, because he is, basically a secondary character in the Iliad. We see him in the background of a lot of scenes. We hear he's Achilles' most beloved companion. And then, he sort of has this thing where he steps out and, spoiler, is killed by the Trojans. And all of a sudden, Achilles just loses it. Mm-hmm. And Achilles has been telling us the whole time that The only thing that matters to him is his reputation. The only thing that matters is sort of Agamemnon, who's the head of the Greek forces, respecting him and getting the respect of the army. And as soon as Patroclus is killed, all that is completely out the window. And so I was really interested in the fact that, the Iliad is a poem about death. There is just death everywhere. And there are grieving parents and grieving wives and grieving sisters and brothers. There's just grief and death all over the poem. And even within that, Achilles' grief is just so towering. The Iliad begins, sing goddess of the rage of Achilles, but it could also begin, sing goddess of the grief of Achilles, because those two things are really joined. And so I wanted to understand, I felt like Homer is showing us the end of this story, but he's not really showing us the beginning. Who is Patroclus? Why? Why is he the most beloved companion of Achilles? Why does it turn out that Achilles actually cares about him more than anything else in his life, including his reputation? And so it was sort of that mystery. And then at the same time, I felt like I had been really frustrated by the fact that, in the ancient world, Achilles and Patroclus, the interpretation of them as lovers was very common. There was sort of the tradition of them as closest companions that existed, and then there was a tradition of them as lovers. And, Plato references them being not only lovers, but ideal lovers. And, there are a bunch of these things, but I felt that had really dropped out. And that any time I saw them referenced, I saw close friend, good friend, war comrade, things like that. Which, not to say that you can't have that intensity of feeling about those, but I felt like, to me, every time I read the Iliad, Achilles' mourning for Patroclus is so physical. He embraces his body all night long. He weeps over it. He can't let the body go. It just, to me, it really suggested this romantic attachment that I wanted to kind of bring back into the tradition and bring back attention to. So that was sort of part of it for that. And then with Circe, I think I was really frustrated by how, we finally get this interesting female character, and she's so truncated, and, she starts out turning men into pigs, and then Odysseus pulls his sword on her, and then that's it. She falls to her knees, and she, is kind of into a supporting role in his story. And so I think I wanted, can we let this female character have her own story? And I'm not really sure why Circe, and I think that's sort of the mystery in some ways of, I don't know if maybe my therapist and my friends and family could say why Circe, but I feel like that she and Patroclus were characters that I have had sort of an obsession with for a really long time. And so, they were characters that I had sort of felt passionate about, I was curious about, I felt like I had something to say about, and so they were the ones.
That makes perfect sense to me. I mean, Patroclus, for instance, something we haven't said yet, puts on Achilles' armor and goes out and disguises himself as Achilles to lead the Greeks into battle so that they think that their hero has not walked off the field because he's been mistreated by Agamemnon. So the idea that he's dressing up as his closest friend, as his lover, as his companion is kind of a wonderfully compelling image.
Yeah.
I also want to say that I think it's amazing and wonderful that in a time when so many kids and young people and adults haven't read the myths, they don't study Latin and Greek, and a lot of them don't even know who Circe is, or Patroclus or Patroclus. How do you?
Both are totally valid. I say Patroclus because that's what my teacher said when I was in school. But I think Patroclus is more British, so they're both. You will hear both.
Well, then
you say whatever makes sense to you.
Tomato, tomato, potato, potato. Let's call the whole thing off.
That's right.
Well, the thing is, it's like people who don't even know who these characters are loving your books, and I think it's wonderful that your books are bringing the stories alive again in our culture.
Well, thank you. One of the things that, as a Latin teacher and a Greek teacher that I love is bringing people into these stories for the first time. And I know that people are often intimidated by them. For instance, they worry they're not saying the name right, or they've never heard of these names. I had a good friend who had absolutely no background in classics whatsoever. And I would sort of enthuse to her about classics all the time, and I would come and get really excited about the Iliad. And, at one point she turned to me and she said, if you say the name Agamemnon one more time, time. I'm going to have to walk away. And so, I think people sort of have that like they hear those long names and they turn off. They feel like it's something elitist or something that just belongs to a particular, type of people. But I think that these stories are and should be for everyone. And in fact, in the ancient world, they were, because Homer came out of oral tradition. And so these were stories that parents were telling their children, grandparents were telling their children, and their grandchildren. These were things that were passed down and told and retold and shaped by all these multiple tellers. And so I love that. I love that about them. And I never want anyone to feel like they have to do homework before they read one of my books. So I try and have it be an introduction if you don't know the story, as well as sort of having goodies in there if you do.
Right.
So is it safe to say then the concept that I guess HBO has picked it up?
Yeah.
This idea of taking your work and putting it out to all of us out here in the rabble via HBO is actually part of the rabble to Frost. I don't care what you think. So I imagine that this is actually kind of great for you.
Oh, yes. I'm absolutely thrilled. I'm really, really thrilled. And I think also as a classicist, there's so many different versions of these myths. There's no such thing as the definitive version of the Achilles myth. You can talk about Homer's version and Ovid's version and Virgil's version and on down through the David Malouf's version and on down sort of through the centuries.
Monty Python
but
version.
There's no
the HBO version.
Yeah. Shakespeare's version.
Right.
But that's all to the good. That the more versions we have of this, the better.
So you don't have like a version of version.
Version of version.
A version of version.
You mentioned so doing the versions of these stories and these characters. You mentioned favorite books in one interview that you did, which included John Updike's Gertrude and Claudius, the story pre-Hamlet. And that's a wonderful book. But I was also surprised that John Gardner's Jason and Medea didn't get a nod, or Grendel at the very least didn't get a nod.
Or any of our books.
Yeah. or any of our books. Yes, right. I'm going home now. No, so
they are all a deep inspiration.
Yeah.
But I actually I don't know what it was about Grendel. It didn't. I think I need to read it again. I am one of those people that if I read a book and sometimes I'm just not in the space to receive whatever it is telling me, and then I'll try it again and love it. So maybe I need to give Grendel another shot, because I read it and it just didn't, I don't know, it didn't coalesce for me somehow. Whereas Gertrude and Claudius really did. And maybe that's because I also have a background in Shakespeare, but I don't have a background in Beowulf. So I don't know. But on the other hand, I love The Mere Wife, which is the more recent retelling of Beowulf. So I need to give Grendel another shot, because I don't know what happened.
So did you find yourself like connecting Cersei all over the place? Because I can almost imagine you having a board in the room, because she's related to everybody everywhere. So you've got Jason there, you've got the Minotaur, you've got Pasiphae, you've got all of these characters who are sort of touchstones for her life, that I can just see these strings going from the picture of Cersei to maybe Waterhouse's picture of Cersei. I don't know, somebody's picture of Cersei.
Yes.
This character and that character and that character, and like this giant connect the dots approach to writing her story. Did you do that sort of thing?
I am not. I hate to admit this, given that I'm a former teacher, but I'm not an outliner. So I know.
Wait, you're a classicist pantser?
Wow!
Cool. They call them toga,
right?
Toga-ers. Sorry.
Someone asked me the other day if I was a pantser, and I actually didn't know what they were talking about, and so I was like, I don't know. I don't pull down people's pants. Is that
so I think it does mean that in certain circles, 5-year-olds.
That's right.
Like your daughter.
Yeah.
I am a little bit of a pantser in writing, and I think that I make sure I know all those things in my mind, but sometimes I will write down. I want to make sure I hit kind of this, and this. But I also always want to make sure that it's not overly programmed, that I can't actually write out of order, that my character, I feel like I don't know who Cersei is in chapter 16 until I've written chapter 15. And so I don't always know what characters are going to emerge and sort of what situations are going to emerge and how. So I sort of had kind of 4 major touchstones, which were kind of like what you laid out. And it's one of the things I love about Cersei is that her myth touches all these other myths. You know, her sister is the mother of the Minotaur, her brother is the father of Medea, so her myth touches Jason, and she's cousin to Prometheus, who brings fire to mankind. So there's all these sort of associations with these huge mythologies, as well as the Odysseus story. So I knew Medea was going to show up. I knew that the Minotaur, she was definitely going to be there for the mirth of the Minotaur. You can't turn that down as a novelist.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And you know, but I didn't necessarily know how it was all going to play out. And it was just a matter of kind of trying it and feeling what organically happened. The only part of the story that I really knew ahead of time was actually the ending. The ending was in my mind from the beginning, and then I sort of had to do a bunch of writing to find the beginning, and then it was just kind of shooting the arrow from the beginning to that ending that was in my mind. So I loved knowing that those sort of touchstones were there. They were kind of like hoops I was definitely going to go through, but I didn't know what order I was going to necessarily go through them. I mean, I was sort of trying to construct a rough timeline of Greek mythology, which is always a little bit, frustrating to do because they don't really match up. But tricky, right. So I knew that a lot of that stuff had to happen before Odysseus, because Theseus is the generation, or a couple generations before the Trojan War. And so the Minotaur had to be happening before we got to Odysseus. And likewise, Medea, Jason is sort of also before. And so I had some, rough chronology going on there, but I also tried to give myself room.
So you just kind of alluded to knowing the ending. So when you started, were you aware, like Cersei ultimately is a woman who's finding her power and her voice and so on. Were you writing this with that theme in mind, or was story your focus? Or something else?
Yeah, well, there were sort of 2 things that led me, and I'm going to try and talk about this without giving away the ending. But there's this description of Cersei in Homer where she's described as the dread goddess who speaks like a human. And it's a very mysterious description. It's actually only one word in the Greek, audeasa, speaking like a human. And it's pretty unclear what that word even really means. So I was immediately drawn in as a novelist to thinking, what would it be like to be this powerful creature who has a voice that belongs to the world of mortals? Automatically I'm thinking, well, she's going to be a person trapped between worlds. She's not really going to belong in the world of the gods because gods have these big, powerful, booming voices. But she also doesn't really belong in the world of mortals. And so I sort of saw, when you're dealing with a character who is caught between worlds with a foot in either world, in this case, I saw there being sort of a natural movement from one world to the other, as she sort of tries to find out where she fits in, which world she fits in. And at the same time, there was actually a myth about sort of Cersei's ending. One of the myths about her ending is that she has a son with Odysseus. The son with Odysseus goes off to find his father, and then brings Penelope, Odysseus's wife, who is famous for her weaving and her faithfulness in the Odyssey, and also Odysseus' son, Telemachus, back to the island. So now we have Circe and her son with Odysseus on the island, and Penelope, Odysseus' wife, and her son with Odysseus, Telemachus, on the island. And what happens is this sort of like weird thing where Circe and Telemachus get married, and then Penelope and Telegonus get married. So there's like a son swap. They marry each other's sons. And then Circe makes them all God. And that just, I thought, what a unrealistic ending. Which, I do have 6-headed monsters in my story, so I always feel kind of funny saying that. But it felt incredibly unearned and unreal and sort of fairy tale and slapped on.
Did they focus?
And so I knew I wasn't going with that ending. I knew right away I was going to subvert and push against that ending. And I think I have also always seen the Greek gods as being absolutely horrendous.
Yeah.
They, I see them as being what today we would call them sociopathic narcissists. Yeah. They are only interested in themselves. And so I saw Circe's journey as being witchcraft and tame lions aside, being the story of this woman born into an incredibly abusive and disturbed family and sort of trying to find her own way in the world. And so all of that sort of was there kind of from the beginning. That was sort of a basic structure. And oftentimes it happens just from my like visceral reaction to the myth. I've learned to sort of trust that I read that myth about Circe and I was like, ugh, definitely not. And, that sort of ends up sparking something. And then that rubs against the reaction I had to Circe being the dread goddess who speaks like a human. And so a lot of this is just sort of, it feels a little bit like pinball, like sort of pinballing around in my brain. So, and that's just, I don't know, that's just how I work. And if I don't respond to the myths passionately, then I just don't include them. There's a myth about Circe turning this guy into a woodpecker that I was like, no, not interesting. So, which isn't to say that someone else couldn't.
That was Mary's phone.
That was a little bit of a ringtone interlude.
Sorry.
So while Mary's playing with her phone,
did I say a bad word that could be heard?
I don't think so.
I have a question about something else, which you claimed, you've said that you enjoy working. So you claim.
You said you had fun in this podcast.
You enjoy working with high school students with this material.
What's that like?
It's like this, obviously.
It is wonderful, actually. It's really, really wonderful. And I have often had students come in, highly dubious about whether or not they're going to like this story. And I feel like if you just can tell it in the right way, how can you not be engaged by the story, particularly Achilles' story, which I think is the story of a young man in particular who's struggling, a young person struggling with this choice and having to live with this choice he's made. Achilles, when he's a teenager, is given the choice of living a long and happy life or dying young and being famous forever, which is I think a horrible choice, but particularly a horrible choice to make as a teenager. Mm-hmm. And so saying to my students, Achilles was your age when he made this choice, and then he went off to war knowing that he was not coming home. He made the choice to die young and be famous forever. And the Iliad is kind of the story of him having to live with that choice.
I want to follow up with that because I wrote a version of the Toynbee Coalnia, the Cattle Raid of Cooley, the Irish epic saga years ago, and that's the same decision that Cuchulainn is given. He can either be famous forever and die young as a great warrior, or he can live a comfortable life to an old age. And of course, he chooses to die young and be important and famous and a great warrior.
And clearly, you made the other choice. Right?
I did. So I'm just sitting here in a chair. But I think that's fascinating that sort of thing is again a universal.
Sort of
It really is.
Universal motif.
Thing.
Yeah. So what you said about the Circe and her family being so dysfunctional and the sociopathic narcissist. What if she was? What if you put that story today?
There's no sociopathic narcissist in our society today. What are you saying?
I mean, how would her character respond to today's?
Well, she wouldn't have to work very hard to turn him into a pig. That's for sure.
I know. Pigs are. I would take a pig any day.
Very honorable creatures, pigs.
Really?
Yes.
Yeah. I think that. So I started writing the book in 2010 when the 2016 election was, frankly, unthinkable.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I have always been interested in sort of narcissists and narcissism and there were a bunch of studies that people have done where they have shown psychologically that the more power and wealth and privilege that people have, the more their empathy starts dropping. Mm-hmm. And it is possible to counteract it and to fight against it if you're aware of it, to say, I need to remember that I'm also human, and all of that stuff. So you can fight against it. But if you do not fight against it, there's sort of this natural psychological thing that happens in people's brains where they think, I have all this money, I'm on top, it must be because I deserve it. And if I deserve it and I'm on top, it must be because those people who are on the bottom, they must deserve what they have. So it's fine for me to step on them. And that is sort of this like toxic thing that happens in humans. And so I was really interested in the gods as the ultimate example of that. This example of people who are so isolated from consequences, who are so protected, so able to fulfill their fantasy at any moment, and how bad that is for people, how incredibly bad that is. And and it's actually the same stories in King Lear. I also love King Lear, which I think tells that story as well. King Lear, he tells us no one has told him no for 80 years. Mm-hmm. And the first time his daughter defies him, he blows up his family. Yeah. And so I think he is able, because he is not a god, and he is a human, and although he has narcissistic leanings, he actually is not a true narcissist. He's capable of change. And he does change over the course of the play, and he realizes, oh my gosh, I haven't been thinking about other people. I've only been thinking about myself. I need to take care of my subjects who are suffering. And, he reconnects with his empathy. And I think that for me, I always feel passionately that empathy is one of humanity's most potent and also best saving graces. And so I think empathy is at the core, sort of looking at empathy is at the core of my work always. And so I was sort of thinking about what do these gods look like who have no empathy? Mm. What does it mean if you are born in this setting of no empathy? And then, of course, I was in final edits as 2016 was happening and 2017 was happening, and it was sort of horrifying to have all that. I mean, and not only was the narcissist in chief stuff happening, but also the Me Too movement was happening, which was it was sort of eerie, actually. Yeah, it was sort of eerie.
It's kind of a be careful what you wish for situation.
Like your story coming to life. Yeah. Except now there's no island to retreat to.
Yeah.
So one more thing. What are you working on now?
So now I am. I mentioned that I have a background in Shakespeare. So I have two projects. One is inspired by The Tempest, which is a play I've been thinking about for a long time. Normally, when I think about Shakespeare plays, I want to direct them. The Tempest, I don't want to direct. I want to write about it. And then I'm also thinking about Virgil's Aeneid, which is the other sort of great ancient epic. But I think the Tempest is going to come first. Knock on wood.
So exciting! How do you manage to write with two little kids?
It's tough.
You dip them in the ink and you drag them across the table. Jeez, why is that hard?
Are you how involved are you in the HBO show?
Not at all. I mean, it's still in the very beginning stages, but I don't really have. I think the writer doesn't have a lot of control over it. Mm-hmm. I think I picked the people that I thought really understood the book, and so now it's in their hands.
So you're not going to be in the writer's room or anything like that?
I may visit. I'm technically an executive producer, but I don't really know what that means.
It means you keep getting paid.
Exactly.
It means they hand you money occasionally.
Nicely done.
Yeah, not a bad spot to be.
Yeah. That's great.
You're in the end of the business that actually makes a living.
Yeah, that's terrific.
We've heard of this. How does that work?
Yeah. So excited.
But
I can't wait to see what they come up with.
I mean, I would love to be as involved as they would let me. But I also acknowledge that, my background is theater. It's not in screenwriting at all. And I have no idea how to write for TV. It's totally its own art. And so, I want to be there to be a resource on the characters and psychology and motivations and that kind of stuff. But I'm also really aware that TV is entirely its own thing. And, as a person who works with adaptation, I understand that, you don't always transform like A to A, B to B, right. That there has to be some sort of alchemical change that goes on when you move formats.
Well, I hope they do you justice.
So when you say theater, what aspect of theater? Did you come from the acting side, the directing side, the playwright side?
Directing.
Okay.
Keith is an actor.
Is wonderful. Yeah. No, I'm definitely not an actor. That's terrifying to me.
That's right.
He terrifies us,
and
too.
Directors terrify me, so there you go. So I think on that note, we're going to move on, or we're going to let Mary move on. So Mary, you're on.
We're unfortunately, because I'd love to talk to you all day, but we're at the end of our time. So I need to ask you the ultimate question of the podcast, which is, can you give us two lies and a truth?
Okay.
So we can
and you can't just say yes or no.
All right, here we go.
Okay.
Here we go. All right, I got these.
Right.
Okay, I have been skinny dipping at Troy.
Ooh.
I have been in a hot air balloon crash.
Closed?
And my sense of humor is most influenced by Voltaire.
Woo.
And that's two lies and a truth.
One truth.
That's 2 lies and a truth.
I say skinny dipping.
Me too. I'm for skinny dipping.
I like skinny dipping too, but I'm not sure it's the truth necessarily.
I'm going to go for the hot air balloon crash.
Yeah,
based on what I hear, she has been skinny dipping, not necessarily in Troy.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
The hot air balloon thing, I don't buy it. I kind of think her sense of humor comes from Voltaire myself.
So we have.
Well, he's dead. He's not using it. So come on.
You're right. So she borrowed it.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough.
So you've got 1 Voltaire, 1 balloon,
and 2 skinny dips.
All right. So somebody's right and somebody's wrong. That's such is life. So what is it?
All right. So I get to reveal what the truth was.
What's the truth?
All right. The truth was a hot air balloon crash.
Thank you.
There you go.
Thank you.
Hey.
Thank you.
So what happened?
Well done,
I've been in a hot air balloon. That's a terrifying
I wish I had been skinny
thing.
dipping.
Yeah.
I wish I had been skinny dipping at Troy, but I have not, sadly.
So what happened in the
that
hot
seems
air
like
balloon?
a good life goal.
Indeed.
And Voltaire is very highbrow. When I was a kid, the comedy writer I most loved to read was Dave Barry.
Dave Barry.
A lot of people mix him up a lot.
He's
Dave Barry, Voltaire.
Yeah.
Very much the same. Very similar.
Very similar dress. So what happened with the hot air balloon?
Yeah, we have to hear.
Yeah, so I was in Cappadocia, which if you ever get the chance to go to Cappadocia, it is this sort of amazing alien landscape in Turkey. It's so beautiful, and you take a hot air balloon ride over at dawn, and it's just like the most amazing. It's like one of those top 10 lifetime moments. But then it came time for our hot air balloon to land, and the wind had kind of picked up, and the guide was like, I don't know. So we tried to land, and it didn't work, and it tried to land, and the wind sort of kept whipping the balloon away. And the people in the balloon, me and my husband included, were starting to get a little nervous. And so there were a couple sort of more failed landings where we would try and go down, and then the wind would pull us away. And finally, basically, they were like, we're going to pull the ripcord and crash. And so we were like, okay. And they're like, get in crash positions. So we all got into crash positions. We did, in fact, sort of like, bang on the ground pretty hard. We landed on our side. One guy got his glasses broken. It was like pretty dramatic. We were all mostly okay, other than the glasses, and a few kind of cuts and bruises. And then the people who ran the tour company rushed over, and they all had champagne. I think they were sort of like, champagne, hooray!
Here, get drunk, forget your hurts. It's okay. Yeah.
Well, I don't want to ruin your. They give you champagne after a balloon ride anyway. Yeah.
Oh, they do? That wasn't even special?
No.
Oh, Mary.
I'm sorry.
Mary.
That's
so spoiled. Why would you tell somebody that? You know what, Madeline? She's making that up. That's not true at all.
She has no empathy, okay?
This is why we can't get guests.
This is what happened.
Oh dear!
So you don't even get anything for surviving a balloon crash.
They say any landing you can stagger away from.
That's right. That's a good one. That's a good one.
That's right.
Madeline, it's been a pleasure. I hope to run into you one of these days, since we're almost neighbors. So
yeah,
I would love that. I hope I see you around the Philadelphia Narberth mainline area.
Yeah,
sounds good in theory.
The near birth area.
Yeah, the near birth.
Yes, exactly.
It's got bad connotations all by itself.
Thank you. I can't wait to see your show, your book on TV, and lots of good luck on your next book. Can't wait for it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you for having me. This was so lovely. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Madeline, and we are.
If you enjoy the Liars Club podcast and the other fine shows on Project Entertainment Network, check out the cool stuff for sale at the Project Entertainment Network store, or consider supporting Project Entertainment Network on Patreon.com. And as always, many thanks for your continued support.
My Favorite Story, a podcast author anthology featuring short fiction from the hosts of the Project Entertainment Network shows. 3 Guys with Beards, Jim Moore, Jonathan Maybury, and Chris Golden.
Tom Clark from Necrocast, It On.
Brian Keane of The Horror Show, Chuck Buda, and Armand Rosamilli of the Mando Method,
Mary San Giovanni of Cosmic Shenanigans,
Jay Wilburn from Matters of Faith,
John Urban sick of ink stains,
Biz Zung's Mr. Frank.
Available on Kindle and in paperback and through the Project Entertainment Network store.
www.projectentertainmentnetwork.com.
This has been an exclusive presentation of the Project Entertainment Network.